This video will get you ready for every subject in the TExES Core Subjects EC-6 exam. If you want to guarantee you'll pass, check out our full-length study guide here or in the description below. Let's get into it.
This video is going to prepare you for the Core Subjects EC-6 English Language Arts and Reading subtest. And this video is going to cover three things: what's on the test and how to study for it, the biggest concepts to know for test day, and we're going to look at a few practice questions. Let's jump right into it. Now, the Core Subjects EC-6 English Language Arts and Reading test consists of 10 areas called competencies. These are oral language, word analysis and identification skills, reading fluency, reading comprehension and applications, vocabulary development, reading inquiry and research, writing conventions, written communication, viewing and representing, and assessment and developing literacy. I know, that's a lot. Each competency has descriptive statements that give more detail, but still quite not enough. Now, if you want to see everything this exam covers, get a 240 study guide. The link is below. And let me go ahead and give you a tip. A lot of these questions are scenario-based. This means not only do you need to know the language arts content, but you'll have to apply it to a variety of teaching situations to find your best answer for the questions. Okay, let's take it from the top and talk about some of the most important things to know. The first competency is oral language. This involves the listening and speaking skills students need to develop as a foundation for learning to read. To develop their language skills, students need many opportunities to speak to a variety of audiences. Make it sound like they're doing public speaking. Don't worry, it's nothing like that. It just means that students need lots of practice talking with one partner, a small group of classmates, or participating in a whole group discussion. One good tactic for audiences of students is using sentence frames or sentence stem. Sentence frames give students part of a sentence, then they fill in the rest. They can be a great tool to help them explain their thinking or use more complex sentence structures. For example, if students are working with partners, the teacher might give them sentence frames to guide their conversation, such as, "I agree with you because," or "Why do you think?" The teacher can model using the sentence frames and post them on an anchor chart for the students to reference. Here's a sentence frame for you. "I will pass the EC-6 because I use 240. Remember to check that link below. Okay, now that we've talked about developing students' oral language, we're ready for the second competency. Competency 2 is word analysis and identification skills. Under this topic, students are ready to learn the nuts and bolts of how to read on their own. There are several different strategies readers can use to identify a word. Let's zoom in on structural analysis. Structural analysis, also known as morphemic analysis or simply word analysis, refers to the process of breaking words into meaningful parts, or morphemes, to determine what those parts mean and putting them back together to determine the meaning of the whole word. Those meaningful parts are often prefixes, root words, and suffixes. Here are some examples. Revisit. This can be broken into the prefix re and the root word visit. Colorful. This word has a root, color, and a suffix, full. Unbelievable. This one has a prefix un, root believe, and suffix able. On your exam, you might be asked to select a word that morphemic analysis would work on. Let's make it a fun one. On which one would you use morphemic or structural analysis? Coffee, early, decaffeinated, drowsy. The answer is decaffeinated because you can break the word into the prefix D, the root caffeine, and the suffix ate to understand that it means this coffee better have caffeine in it so I can have enough energy to get through this video. Let's keep moving to the third competency. Competency 3 is reading fluency. Do you know the three components of fluency? There are accuracy, prosody, and speed. You might be asked a question about automaticity, which is the ability to read words effortlessly. For example, a student may spend a significant amount of time decoding words to have a strong accuracy, but this would lower their speed. Students need to develop their automaticity to be truly fluent readers. You'll need to know some strategies for improving students' fluency. Choral reading Partner reading and reader's theater are examples. It is especially helpful to have students read text at their independent level and to have them reread the same text multiple times. Basically, just have students read, read, and read, then read some more. I used to love to send a student to read to another person in school, a counselor, custodian, even the principal. They'd always come back glowing with pride, and it was great practice for fluency. On to competency 4, reading comprehension and applications. Here, students move from learning to read to reading to learn. You need to know the difference between literal, inferential, and evaluative comprehension. And you'll need to be able to recognize which strategies or types of questioning are best to develop each kind of comprehension. To build literal comprehension, work on things like summarizing and identifying plot elements like setting. For inferential comprehension, help students recognize cause and effect relationships and make predictions. To develop evaluative comprehension, model metacognition, and help students make opinions about text. To practice many of these skills, I loved using graphic organizers. When my team would be planning a reading lesson, I'd always say, I've got a graphic organizer for that. So I wasn't as popular as the guy who always brought in the donuts, but your girl was pretty cool. I could talk about reading comprehension for days, but it's time to move on. Don't forget to stick around till the end of the video because I've got a practice comprehension question with your name on it. Here we are at the 5th competency, vocabulary development. In order for students to progress as readers, it's important that they understand the meaning of the words they're reading. So, vocabulary instruction is an important part of teaching English language arts and reading. Most vocabulary is learned indirectly. Teachers should expose students to targeted words in multiple contexts. A great way to do this is to plan a thematic or integrated unit so you can provide your students with lots of different opportunities to read, write, hear, and speak using the new terms. The more times a student comes across a vocabulary word, the more likely they are to make connections between those contexts and internalize the meaning of the word. You've made it through half the competencies. You're doing great. This is the time you are investing in yourself to prepare for your test. Now, if you keep sticking with me through the second half, you'll be able to say you reviewed the entire outline of the English language arts and reading test. We've got this. Competency 6 is reading, inquiry, and research. I'm sure you're inquiring about what you'll need to research to pass this section. Well, sit back and relax because that's what I'm here for. We need to teach students the valuable skills of finding information from a variety of sources to answer questions. Here are the basic steps to the research process. First, develop a question to answer through research. This will become a thesis statement for high-level research. Next, locate credible sources with information that can be used to answer the research question. Then, create notes with paraphrased and summarized information from the sources. Finally, organize the information into product to demonstrate findings from the research. This may be a graphic organizer, visual presentation, or expository essay. It's important to have a clear objective and a plan, and make sure students are starting with an open-ended question, like, why do volcanoes erupt? Is a better research question than, what temperature is magma? The 7th competency is writing conventions. This is all about how students develop in their use of grammar, spelling, and punctuation. I'm going to go over the most important things to know within the topic of spelling. Spelling development unfolds in a predictable sequence. Here are the stages you'll need to know. In the pre-communicative spelling stage, a child uses letters from the alphabet to represent words without demonstrating knowledge of letter-sound correspondence. The words appear as random strings of letters. In the semiphonetic stage, some knowledge of letter-sound correspondence is apparent in a child's attempt to spell. It is common to see single letters used to represent whole words, syllables, or sounds in which multiple letters are conventionally used. As a child progresses to the phonetic spelling stage, they use a letter or a group of letters to represent every sound heard in a word. Spelling choices still may not be conventional, but they are understood through the lens of letter-sound correspondence. The fourth stage is transitional spelling stage, in which a child moves from depending solely on knowledge of letter-sound correspondence to incorporating knowledge of word structure and common visual representations of words in their spelling as well. More conventional spelling is present in the child's writing, but misspellings are still common and frequent. Last is a conventional spelling stage, when a student can apply knowledge of letter-sound relationships, general spelling rules, and morphology in their spelling. The child is better able to recognize misspellings and the spelling in their writing as generally correct. Now, you might be thinking, everybody uses autocorrect. We don't need to teach spelling anymore. But we do, because teaching students conventional spelling frees up some of their brain power so they can focus on what they're writing, like their purpose and audience. Speaking of purpose and audience, competency 8 is written communication. As part of their journey as budding writers, students must understand that there are many different reasons to write. Quality writing instruction includes teaching students about task or the writing assignment, purpose, which is the intention for writing, and intended audience, or the recipient of the writing piece. When students have the right tools, they can know their audience and accomplish their writing goals. Writing a letter to a real person is an example of writing for a meaningful, authentic purpose. When I taught, while we were studying animal needs, I had my students assess the animal enclosures at our local zoo and write a letter to our local zookeeper with their recommendations. Knowing their purpose and intended audience made them feel powerful. That was the biggest thing to know, but there's so much more. I didn't even get to the steps of the writing process. To be sure you're prepared, let 240 help you. Click the link in the description to get our EC-6 English Language Arts and Reading Study Guide. We're getting so close. 2 more competencies to go, and you can proudly say you've reviewed the whole framework of your exam. Competency 9 is viewing and representing. You may be asking yourself, viewing and representing what? This competency is all about media. Elementary students need direct instruction and a practice with interpreting media such as a computer, television, magazine, and radio. It's important to teach the different functions and purposes of media. In particular, provide and discuss examples of persuasive media such as political cartoons, magazines, newspapers, TV and computer ads, and signs in stores or on the highway. Direct students to first look only at the pictures rather than the text and try to determine what the writer or illustrator is trying to say. You can model this with slides or printed material, asking students to determine the connotative or denotative meanings of the examples. After discussing how visuals enhance meaning through various colors, styles, pictures, or media, you can have students create their own advertisements. Just a word of the wise: try to avoid the beer commercials. You made it to the finish line, to the top of the volcano, to the 10th competency. This one is assessment of developing literacy. There are lots of different kinds of assessments to measure students' literacy skills. 2 important ones to know are formative and summative assessments. Formative assessments are assessments for learning. They are used to guide instruction, meaning they're administered to assess students' progress towards meeting a learning objective so teachers can adjust instruction as needed. They help teachers answer the question, what do I teach next? Examples of formative assessments are exit slips, running records, or simply observing students. Summative assessments are assessments of learning. They are used to gauge instruction by determining whether or not students mastered a learning objective. Teachers use them to answer the question, what did my students learn? Meaning, what do they know now, or what are they able to do? Examples of summative assessments include quizzes, graded work at the end of a unit, or standardized assessments, like the Developmental Reading Assessment, or DRA. Now, speaking of assessment, it's time for you to assess your knowledge of the topics we've covered in this video today. Let's look at some practice questions to show how those concepts can appear on the test. If you want a lot of practice questions, you can click on the free practice test below. At the end, you'll get a score report on how well you did on the test. Now, for the questions. Here's one from the first competency, oral language. A first grade teacher has informally assessed her students' oral language skills and identified certain students in need of support while orally answering comprehension questions. Which of the following activities would best support these students' oral language development? Expand vocabulary through reading a variety of genres, schedule regular, formal assessments of their oral language skills. During whole class discussions, regularly call on students to answer open ended questions, provide sentence stems or sentence frames to scaffold their oral language skills. This is the correct answer. Like we talked about at the beginning of the video, using sentence stems is an effective way to encourage the use of oral language skills while also providing support that will help build speaking competence. Let's look at one from competency 2. Here's one of those tricky structural analysis questions. Which of the following word sets would best support a lesson on structural analysis? Ate, eat, eating, eaten, visit, revisit, visitor, visiting, sweep, leap, heap, jeep, late, ripe, hike, wire. This is the right choice. Like I said earlier in the video, structural analysis refers to breaking the word down into recognizable chunks to ease decoding. All of these words contain the word visit with varying prefixes and suffixes, so they would work as examples to explain the meaning of structural analysis. What about competency 3, fluency? What might those questions look like? A selection of students have been called aside for individual instruction based on the area they struggled in on the last recent assessment. The teacher presents the students with a simple sentence such as, "The cat ran very fast." The teacher reads the sentence one word at a time with no annotation or expression. Then she models how, when people read and speak, it is natural to emphasize certain words in a sentence. She tells the group, "Today we will be working on adding emphasis to a sentence and thinking about the effect that has on our understanding. I will call on you and tell you what word to emphasize, and then you will say the sentence saying that specific word strongly." The teacher models once again, this time reading, "The cat ran very fast." Based on the nature of this activity, which area of reading fluency did the students need additional instruction in? Prosody, accuracy, speed, automaticity. Did you think I was going to show you a question about automaticity since I called it out earlier? Not this time. Through the question feedback in the study guide, I can see that automaticity is the ability to read words effortlessly. This activity is focusing on how to emphasize words and how that changes the meaning of a sentence, which would fall in the realm of prosody. So, this is the answer. Now for the comprehension question that had your name on it. Miss Wright is reading a fiction story aloud to her class. She stops throughout the model to think aloud strategy. In her think aloud moments, she makes predictions about what will happen next and reflects on what the characters learn throughout each plot event. What level of reading comprehension is she modeling for her students? Literal comprehension, evaluative comprehension, inferential comprehension, or circumstantial comprehension? Okay, right off the bat, we know that circumstantial comprehension isn't even one of the levels of comprehension, so we can ignore that one. This is the right one. The teacher was modeling the ability to understand what was read without it being stated explicitly, which is inferential comprehension. She is using her background knowledge along with what is happening in the story to make inferences about what might happen next and what the characters learn. Now, let's look at a vocabulary question. How can a fourth grade teacher indirectly expose her students to content specific vocabulary that they will need in their upcoming unit as a part of the indirect and direct vocabulary instruction over the terms? Provide students with a list to define each word before the unit begins. Purposefully and frequently use the terms in class. Encourage students to use dictionaries when they come across unfamiliar words. Require students to find examples of the words used in the real world. This is the best choice. Purposefully and frequently using the terms in the class will naturally expose them to the words and provide context for how they were used in a sentence. Since the teacher isn't directly defining or teaching these terms, it would be one of the various ways to indirectly expose them to the new vocabulary. Up next, reading, inquiry, and research. During a unit on conducting or writing research reports, a fifth grade teacher models each step of the research process by conducting her own research fully. She models choosing a topic, generating research questions, finding reliable sources, and pulling information from those sources to cite in her research. Which activity should the teacher model next to continue the steps of the research process? Organize research and begin outlining her research report, adjust guiding research questions to meet the information she has found in her readings, begin drafting her essay, starting with the thesis statement, create a bibliography of sources she'll use in her research report. This is the correct answer. Once the teacher has modeled how to find supporting details through research, the next step is organizing this data to then use while writing. She was in between the steps 3 and 4 that I went over earlier in the video. What about a writing conventions question? Let's check one out. A first grade student writes the following sentence on the board: My dog licks my hand, but means my dog licks my hand. Which of the following does this student's sentence best demonstrate? Pre-communicative spelling, semiphonetic spelling, phonetic spelling, transitional spelling. This is the right choice. This stage is when children have some letter awareness. They may spell a lengthy word with a few letters such as play, PA, or talk. Let's look at a question from the 8th competency, written communication. Which of the following would be the most effective way to teach young children about task, purpose, and intended audience? Share and model writing samples that demonstrate appropriate style. Ask students to create their own writing prompts based on their interests. Give a unique writing task each day so students will have exposure to a wide variety of writing models. Prioritize formal style before introducing informal, personal writing tasks. This one's the right answer. Concrete examples of modeling appropriate style would best help young students understand task, purpose, and intended audience. Moving on to competency 9. Which of the following would be the best strategy to teach an elementary student the various forms of persuasive media? Have students read a magazine article and watch a TV documentary for environmental issues. Have students create a commercial for environmental issues. Have students research a political cartoon, a computer editorial, and a highway billboard concerning environmental issues. Have a guest speaker address current events. We talked about having students make their own ads, so I thought this was the answer. But the question feedback feature helped me realize that creating a commercial wouldn't necessarily teach students about persuasive media. Rather, it would be a good way to assess their understanding. So this is actually the answer, since it involves various kinds of persuasive media. Are you ready for your last question? Here it is. From Assessment of Developing Literacy. Which of the following would be an appropriate summative assessment for 4th grade students who are learning about parts of speech? Having students independently label each part of speech for words in a given sentence, guiding students through labeling a different part of speech on a sentence at the beginning of each class, asking students to submit an exit ticket about parts of speech to guide the next day's instruction, inviting students to come to the board to identify parts of speech together. This is the correct answer. A summative assessment individually tests students' knowledge of a subject. Asking students to label parts of a speech independently is a summative assessment which can be used to determine whether students grasp the concept of parts of speech. Now, that's just a small sampling of practice questions to give you an idea about how these concepts are assessed on a test. There is still plenty more to learn.
This video is going to prepare you for the Core Subjects EC-6 Math Subtest. So let's get rolling. Now, the Core Subjects EC-6 Math consists of 5 areas called competencies. These are mathematics instruction and processes, number concepts and operations, patterns and algebra, geometry and measurement, and probability and statistics. And as you may already be able to tell, each of these competencies contains an entire section of math education. But don't worry, we'll break it down piece by piece. And to test each of those pieces, stay with me to the end and check out our test-aligned practice questions. I'm going to walk you through what you need to know for each competency. Let's start with mathematics instruction. Now, this is pretty straightforward. It's really just how you teach math. Within the first competency, there are 2 main things that will show up on your test. First, how to incorporate manipulatives and other tools, like calculators, into your lessons. Counting blocks, tangrams, fraction tiles, and color counters can all be used to enrich students' understanding of mathematical concepts. You'll need to know what they are and when it is appropriate to use them. So, for example, if you're asked what manipulative would best help students understand that 2/4 is equal to 1/2, fraction tiles would be the best choice because students can see that together, 2 1/4 tiles are the same as a half tile. The second half of this competency is pedagogy. This means you'll get questions about teaching math. Let's take a look at standard K from this competency. The beginning teacher uses a variety of formal and informal assessments and scoring procedures to evaluate mathematical understanding, common misconceptions, and error patterns. So basically, being a teacher, you'll need to know all about pre assessments used to assess prior knowledge, the difference between formal and informal assessments, and formative and summative assessments. Since this is math, it's helpful to know about connecting math to the real world and to other subjects like science, music, and business. It's also important to know how to align assessment with instruction and what to do with the results, meaning how they can be used to effectively impact your instruction. So basically, instructing and teaching. Again, like a teacher. Now that we've covered the teaching part, let's start digging into what math you actually need to know. Starting with number concepts and operations. Simply put, you'll need to be able to understand how to combine numbers and how different numbers relate to each other, which is what fancy math people call number sense. So this means you need all the basics: how to add, subtract, multiply, divide, use exponents and parentheses, all that good stuff. And you'll need to be able to do all of that using the order of operations. Remember PEMDAS? And with whole numbers, decimals, and fractions. You know, teaching kids these things they're famous for loving. Moving on to number sense. Remember that one where we talk about numbers relating to each other? So, how do numbers relate to each other? Number relations include factoring, magnitude, and equivalency. And if you need to brush up on any of those, you can watch the videos in our study guide. We've got the link to it in our description. But let me show you a quick clip of one right now. How about we brush up on factors?
Factors can be used to simplify and solve many problems. Factors are numbers or expressions that we can multiply together to get another number or expression. Factors can be numbers. For example, 2 and 3 are factors of 6 because 2 times 3 equals 6. Factors can also be terms or expressions. For example, x plus 1 is a factor within the equation x plus 1, y plus 2 equals 15.
And just like that, we're through with competency 2. And next up on the tour, you'll notice we've arrived at competency 3, patterns in algebra. Let's take a look around. You may already know what's coming here: solve for x. But you'll also need to understand slope-intercept form and how to create an equation from a data set. Solving for x is pretty straightforward. These tests will give you an equation, like this one, and then you have to solve for x. So you would simplify it as much as you can, balance the equation, and you would find that x equals 5. We'll talk a little bit more later about how to solve problems like that one. But for now, let's see what else is hiding in patterns in algebra, like slope-intercept form. For this one, you need to really know one specific equation: y equals mx plus b. In this equation, m is equal to the slope of the line on a graph, and b is the y-intercept, hence the name slope-intercept form. So if you see the equation 3x plus 4 equals y, the slope is 3 and the y-intercept is 4. Last up in this competency, creating equations. Also, apparently, making equations is a math skill. So when you create the equation, you'll be given words and have to translate them into a number sentence. So you'll need to be able to identify keywords that indicate what math actions you need to take. Here is just a small sampling of words you'll see and the mathematical operation they indicate. And you thought this was a math test. Turns out, just for fun, they're going to test us on language too. But don't worry, If this looks like a foreign language, we translate it all in the study guide linked below. This brings us to geometry and measurement, which might just be the most straightforward of all the topics we're covering, because you're going to need to know, well, geometry and measurement. The word geometry really just means the study of shapes. So you'll need to know the attributes of basic shapes. So that includes using the Pythagorean theorem for triangles and knowing how to use different formulas to find the area and perimeter of all the basic shapes. Ooh, we really have a great video on this in our study guide. Let's take a sneak peek inside the guide quickly.
The perimeter is the whole distance around the outside of a figure. It is a one-dimensional measurement, so it always has to be labeled in units such as inches, feet, miles, or centimeters. The area is the amount of surface inside a figure. It is a two-dimensional measurement, so it will be labeled in square units, such as square inches, square miles, square centimeters, or square kilometers. Here are the formulas for finding the perimeter and area of squares, rectangles, and triangles.
See? Super helpful. But again, to really have the confidence you deserve, go subscribe to a 240 study guide. You can get the study guide and this test and all the other EC-6 subtests. Now, what about measurement? A big one here is learning to estimate measures like weight and length and choosing the appropriate units. It helps to have some real-world examples to compare to, like the ones we provided you here. So if someone asks you the height of a classroom, you'd likely measure it in meters. Millimeters, centimeters, and kilometers just wouldn't make sense because your answer would be either really large or really small. All right, the fifth section is probability and statistics. And this, folks, is where we get our math nerd on, and I'm going to encourage you to roll up your sleeves if you haven't already. Kind of like that last section, this one is pretty straightforward. You need to know about probability and statistics. But just because this area has a small range doesn't mean it's simple. If you don't understand these concepts, you're going to get these questions wrong. So make sure you take the time to brush up on how to do these problems. Let's start with stats. In my experience, what's almost guaranteed to show up on the test are central tendency measurements. What's central tendency measurements? They're the mode, median, mean, and range. And here's a tip. You'll probably get mostly graphs and charts to look at. For instance, you may be shown a graph like this one and asked, which type of movie is the most popular among children? First, make sure you know what they're looking at, then read the chart. Or you might have to use the numbers from the chart to do a simple calculation. All right, circling back to probability. A lot of this boils down to simple calculations of how likely is it that a given event is going to happen. And this really boils down to taking the number of successful outcomes possible divided by the total number of outcomes possible. I know we're flying through these, so if you feel a little like you've gotten whiplash, try the study guide. Now that we've gone over some of the big concepts, let's look at some practice questions to show you how those concepts can appear on the test. If you want a lot of practice questions, you can click the free practice test below. At the end, you get a score report on how well you did on that test. Now for questions. Let's head back to the beginning with that mathematics instruction and processes piece, starting with manipulatives. Marcus is a first grade student working on place value task cards at a math center. Each task card shows an image of base 10 manipulatives, and students are to write the corresponding number in standard form on their recording sheet. Marcus selects a card that shows 100s blah and 3 1s cubes. On his recording sheet, he writes that the number shown on the card is 13. Based on this scenario, which of the following tools would be the most effective to provide Marcus? Marcus is struggling to recognize that each place needs to be filled by a digit. even if it is 0. Therefore, a place value chart would be an effective tool for Marcus to use. With the task card described in the question, a place value chart would help Marcus recognize that there are 3 ones, 0 tens, and 100, making the number 103. Let's look at one from the pedagogy piece. In this question, we're dealing with assessing students during the first week of school, meaning the teacher is trying to get a better understanding of her students' current understanding. By giving students the assessment in choice B, the teacher would be able to gauge which of the upcoming vocabulary words her students are already familiar with. This allows the teacher to create lesson plans perfectly matched to the students' current ability levels. Just like that, we've crossed one entire competency off. On to number concepts and operations. Remember the combining numbers part I told you about? You'll need to remember the order of operations. Let's look at how that is reflected in a question. Simplify the expression 82 minus 100 divided by 4 plus 6 times 12. As we start to run through PEMDAS, there are no parentheses or exponents in the expression, so we can skip those steps. Then we move on to multiplication and division from left to right. So 100 divided by 4 equals 25, and 6 times 12 is 72. So now our expression is 82 minus 25 plus 72. Now we can simplify the remaining addition and subtraction from left to right. So our final answer is 129. Boom, nailed it. Time to make sense of number sense. Bobby is buying gumballs for 7 of his friends. There are 51 gumballs before Bobby makes his purchase at the store. Bobby wants to give each of his friends the same amount of gumballs and not have any gumballs left. Which of the following approaches can Bobby use to find the greatest number of gumballs he can purchase to give his friends? Okay, so this might not sound like the factoring questions we talked about earlier, but I promise it is. It's just hidden a little. It's in disguise. If Bobby wants gumballs for each of his 7 friends and none left over, we need to know the multiples of 7. There are only 51 gumballs in the store, so our number has to be lower than that. So our best option is this one. Make a list of the multiples of 7 and then purchase the highest multiple of 7 that is less than 51. Now, it's close to impossible to know every single detail about every math problem that may come up on your exam, but the 240 study guide can get you pretty darn close. You'll walk into your test with confidence that you can pass. Now let's look at an algebra question. Which of the following options shows a logical and correct first step to solving the algebraic equation given? Even though this is algebra, we still need to remember PEMDAS from earlier. So we start with the parentheses. If we distribute the 3 and the negative 5 to their respective parentheses, we'll get this choice. 6x plus 3 minus 5x minus 20 equals 11. We're technically done with this question, but let's try for some bonus points. Okay, so there's no bonus points on the EC-6, but you're going to need to know how to manipulate an equation all the way down to solve for x. So let's practice. We already know that the first step is to distribute. Next, we combine like terms on the same side of the equal sign. Finally, we isolate the x by moving the negative 17 to the other side of the equal sign. This leaves us with x equals 27. Nice. On to slope-intercept. Which of the following equations is written in slope-intercept form? This is where you need to remember y equals mx plus b. The only equation that is in this format is this one, y equals 3x plus 5. Recognizing slope-intercept form is just the first step in using the equation. To really feel confident dealing with slope, you should check out our study guide where we walk you through all of it. This brings us to creating an equation. Maria baked 6 dozen cookies for her classmate. There are 28 students in her class. Each child received 2 cookies, and Maria gave 6 cookies each to her teacher and her principal. which expression shows the number of cookies she had left over? Let's figure out how many cookies Maria started with first. She baked 6 dozen, so 6 times 12. Next, we need to take away all of the cookies she gave out. So we need grouping symbols. We include 2 cookies for each of her 28 classmates and 6 cookies for the principal and the teacher. So this choice is the correct formula. We finished patterns and algebra. We've got just 2 competencies left. Next up, geometry and measurement. We're told the west wall of a square room has a length of 13 feet, and they want the perimeter of the entire room. Well, squares have 4 sides of equal measure. So the perimeter, the area around the figure, would be 4 times 13, which is 52. Here's a measurement question. Which of the following is the best estimate for the height of a 1-story house? A meter is about the length of a guitar, and a 1-story house is about the same height as 5 guitars. So this is the best. Without looking, Jessie draws a marble from the bag shown, replaces it, gives the bag a good shake, and draws again. What is the probability that Jessie drew a red marble both times? On the first draw, the probability of drawing a red marble is 3 out of 10. Since the marble is replaced, the probability of drawing a red marble on the second draw is still 3 out of 10. So the probability of drawing red on both draws is 3/10 times 3/10. And last but not least is statistics. The circle graph shows the results of a survey of 150 students. How many students chose basketball as their favorite sport? This problem gives us survey data, a pie chart, and asks how many students chose basketball as their favorite sport. I see an 8% in the wedge for basketball, so I'm going to pick that choice. Oh, rats? That seemed too easy. Let's take a step back and try again. Since 150 students were asked, the percentage doesn't equal the number of students. Instead, we need to multiply the percentage by the total. So 8% times 150. 8% times 150 gives us a total of 12 students. And that's the last of our practice questions. There is still plenty more to learn.
This video is going to prepare you for the Core Subjects EC-6 Social Studies subtest. There is a lot to cover, so let's get rolling. Now, the Core Subjects EC-6 Social Studies consists of 5 areas called competencies. These are social science instruction, history, geography and culture, economics and government, and citizenship. Now, these seem pretty simple, but entire college courses are taught on each of them. In particular, competency 2 and 3 are the broadest of them all. That means it can be really tough to narrow down just what they might ask. But we've got you covered. Later, we'll look at the most likely topics to show up as a question on your test in those competencies. Before those two, let's start at the top with social studies instruction. Now, this is pretty straightforward. It's really just how you teach social studies. So this is pretty simple. It's the second competency that gets tricky, and we'll get to it. But with the first competency, there are 3 main things to know to get these instruction questions right. First, how to read charts and tables, specifically bar graph, scatter plot, pie chart, a population pyramid, or basic tables. Another one you need to know is maps, specifically topographical maps, meteorological maps, physical maps, and thematic maps. Now, usually, when you're given one of these graphics, you have to look at it, draw a conclusion, and answer a question. Last, there's pedagogy. This means you'll get questions about teaching social studies. Let's take a look at standard K from this competency. The beginning teacher uses a variety of formal and informal assessments and knowledge of the TExES Essential Knowledge and Skills, TExES, to determine students' progress and needs and to help plan instruction that addresses the strengths, needs, and interests of all students, including English language learners and students with special needs. So basically, being a teacher. You'll need to know about pre-assessments to use to assess prior knowledge, the differences between formal and informal assessments, and formative and summative assessments. Since this is social studies, it's helpful to know about open-ended assessments and project-based learning. It's also important to know how to align assessment with instruction and what to do with the results, meaning how they can be used to effectively impact your instruction. So basically, instructing and testing. Again, like a teacher. Now let's get to one of the tricky competencies I mentioned a second ago. It is the second broadest competency we are going to look at. Geography and culture. For the geography section, you'll be asked, how does the geography of the Earth affect human behavior? I know, I'm just as vague as the test creators right now. So let me narrow it down a little bit more for you. Simply put, humans respond to their environments. They might even move because of it. Let's look at an example of responses. Before 1900, every city founded was located near some sort of water source, whether it be the ocean or a river. Fun fact, in 1870, Galveston was the biggest city in Texas. So why water? 1, humans need fresh water to drink, and 2, water was the easiest, most efficient form of transportation. You gotta be able to move goods in and out of the city. And water is just one example of how humans adapted their behavior to respond to their environment. Another thing to know, the causes of human migration. Specifically, there are 4 main reasons humans move: food and water, protection, freedom, and better socioeconomic situations. And if you need to brush up on that, you can watch the whole video in our full study guide. We've got the link to it in our description. And then because it's geography, you need to know major geographic features and where they are relative in the world. Wow, the whole world? Let's be more specific here. Most likely you'll be asked about the Sahara Desert, the Himalayan mountains, the Rocky Mountains, the Appalachian Mountains, the Amazon River, the Ganges River, and the Mississippi River. In addition to just where they are, also know how they impact the people around them. Overall, the geography competency is really important. It's going to have a lot of questions, so you really want to understand this two-way street. How humans interact with their environment and how the environment shapes human behavior. Geography is the second broadest category because it covers so much. But don't worry, we have it all covered for you in our comprehensive study guide. Are you ready to get to the broadest category I told you about? B-R-O-A-D. B-R-O-A-D. That's a funny word. Why isn't it broad? The broadest category on the test is going to be history because it can really cover anything from the beginning of human history till today. And the test makers get a little unfair with the standards of history. Just look at competency 2, which is history. Item B states that a beginning teacher needs to analyze how individuals, events, and issues shape the history of Texas, the United States, and even the world. Gee, thanks. That narrows it down. So in my experience, I've identified a few key concepts that are highly likely to appear on the test and give you a nice leg up. The first one is Columbian exchange. This refers to the trade that was established when Columbus led Europeans to the New World in 1492. Know the goods introduced to the New World from the Old World and goods introduced from the Old World from the New World. Now the second one is the Northwest Passage. Ironically, it doesn't exist. But just because it doesn't exist doesn't mean it's not important. The Northwest Passage is the idea that there's a sea-based trade route between North America that connects the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, which would have allowed the European powers to quickly and easily establish a sea trade between themselves and China. Finding this route was the reason for exploration in the 1600s. Next up, you'll definitely need to know manifest destiny. This is the idea that it was the United States' destiny to stretch from Atlantic to Pacific Ocean, and it fueled Western expansion in the 1840s and 1850s. And the last one you should really know is sectionalism. Sectionalism refers to the growing divide between the northern states and the southern states in the United States prior to the Civil War. The key points of sectionalism you should know include the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Mexican-American War, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, while history is incredibly broad, just knowing those 4 concepts is going to help you out a lot. But again, to really have the confidence you deserve, go subscribe to a 240 study guide. You can get the study guide for this test and all the other EC through 6 subtests. All right, the 4th section is economics, and it's my favorite. Luckily, the standards here are much more targeted in what it covers. This makes our punch list even more valuable. You are pretty much guaranteed to get questions on these. First up, opportunity cost. This really just means that the cost of an event or an action is the next best foregone alternative. Okay, it sounds really fancy, but what it really means is not how much money an action or an event costs someone, but rather what else would they do with that time or money. Next, you'll need to know about scarcity, which just means that in the world we live in, things are not unlimited. So people have to make choices based on their priorities to get what they want, because they can't have everything. Womp womp. Next, you'll need to know about scarcity. Let's pop into the 240 guide to learn about this one.
Humans never have enough of what they want. Our wants always exceed our resources. Even the richest man in the world only has 24 hours in a day. This creates scarcity.
Fabulous! I do still wish I could get everything I want though. Related to scarcity, the third is supply and demand. It's a really basic economic concept. In short, it says that economic activity is based on two forces, the supply of a good and the demand of a good. Hence, the principle of supply and demand. Really creative naming skills, those economists. Anyway, generally, when demand goes up, price goes up. So the supply of that good will go up. When demand goes down, price dips, and the supply of that good goes down. And when economists say supply, they mean the amount that is supplied, as in the amount made. So when demand goes up, people make more of what's in demand. Price, demand, and supply all impact each other. Let's look at how my curriculum team explains it. If prices go up, demand goes down. If prices go up, supply goes up. The fourth thing to know is comparative advantage. Basically, some people, businesses, or nations are better at producing a certain good, and so they can produce it more easily, cheaply, or just plain better than other countries. When this happens, it's known as a comparative advantage. So, I have a comparative advantage when it comes to making study guides. Mine are just plain better. Almost done. Next, the monopoly and oligopoly. And no, I don't mean the board game. A monopoly is where a firm or business has complete control of a market. It can set whatever price it wants. Why? Well, you have no other option. Similarly, an oligopoly means that there's just a few businesses or firms that compete against each other, and sometimes they collude or they work together to set prices artificially high. One more, mercantilism. Man, this is an old one. Mercantilism says that a country's power is measured in how much gold it has. Wait, gold? Money isn't even gold-backed anymore. Well, mercantilism was the prevailing economic philosophy for almost 300 years, between 1500 and 1800. This philosophy drove a lot of decisions during the Age of Exploration, and those are the biggies to know about economics. Okay, but since it's my favorite, and these terms will come up, let's see if I can use them all in one example. When mercantilism was hot, countries wanted gold, so the demand was high, and thus the opportunity cost of anything else was not getting gold. But gold is pretty scarce. You got to be smart on how you use it. The Netherlands had such a comparative advantage on naval trade that they basically became a monopoly and got to set prices. See? It's my favorite. And finally, let's look at Competency 5, Government and Citizenship. By this point, it probably doesn't surprise you to hear that a lot is covered in the descriptive statements. But I'm going to hit some of the highlights with you. I got you. The first concept of government we'll discuss is the Articles of Confederation. This was the first governing document that bound the United States together. But it was not great. The Articles created a weak federal government that couldn't respond to the challenges of the new nation. They were eventually replaced by the Constitution of 1787. The next one is Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine in 1776. Common Sense was a pamphlet that encouraged and rallied support for the American Revolution. Now, the only non-American event on our list is the Magna Carta. It was an agreement between the King of England and the nobles of England. Why is this important to know? It's one of the first documents in history to limit the power of government. Another thing likely to come up on the test is the New Deal. You're thinking of, let's make a deal. The New Deal is a series of economic programs passed under President Franklin D. Roosevelt to help stimulate the American economy during the Great Depression. There are 4 constitutional amendments that are really likely to be on the test: the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 19th. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments deal specifically with the issue of race in America, and they were ratified after the Civil War. These amendments outlaw slavery throughout the United States and make it illegal to prohibit someone from voting based on race or ethnicity. And the 19th Amendment enabled women's suffrage, which is the ability for women to vote. And if you don't understand each of these concepts, because you need to, use the 240 study guide. It'll save you a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of worry, and possibly your job. And finally, for government, I've got 4 court cases that are likely to be on the test. The first is Marbury versus Madison, which established judicial review. Now, judicial review basically states that the Supreme Court can strike down a law it deems unconstitutional. The second is the infamous Dred Scott decision, which said that slaves were property and not entitled to the rights and privileges of citizens of the United States. That was overturned after the Civil War. The third is Plessy versus Ferguson, which said that segregation in schools is allowed and constitutional as long as they are separate but equal. And last is Brown v. Board of Education, which overruled Plessy versus Ferguson by proclaiming that segregation of public schools was unconstitutional because separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And those are the big things to know in Competency 5. Now that we've gone over some of the big concepts, let's look at some practice questions to show you how those concepts can appear on the test. If you want a lot of practice questions, you can click the free practice test below. At the end, you get a score report on how well you did on the test. Did I mention the 240 study guide has a money-back guarantee that you'll pass? Now for questions. Remember, for social science instruction, I told you most of the questions required analyzing a chart or graph or map. Let's look at how that is reflected in a question. Mrs. Sims wants to demonstrate to her students how the price of gasoline has increased over time. Which of the following graphs would best help Mrs. Sims visually demonstrate this concept? A bar graph, pie chart, line graph, or a population pyramid? Since the goal is to see change over time, choice C, line graph, is our best option. Now I have to admit, my first thought was choice A, bar graph. But when I click on that as I'm working through my study guide, I see that it's not the best choice. The best part is the answer feedback also helps me see why bar graph is not correct. Let's look at one from the geography and culture competency. Here's one of those tricky human migration questions. Which of the following best describes why European settlers in California chose to settle near the San Francisco Bay Area? Social studies exam pro tip. Water is a big deal. One of the most important features when settling a new land is the creation of a harbor so that goods can be shipped in and out of the region. So when the first settlers arrived in California, one of their highest priorities was establishing a harbor for trade, and the San Francisco Bay Area is a natural harbor. That means the correct answer is A. Now for the broadest category, history. Which of the following best describes the primary goal of the first French explorers of North America? Well, France wanted to discover a western sea route to trade with Asia, also known as the Northwest Passage. Let's hear a little history. Jacques Cartier was the first Frenchman to explore North America. He was sent in 1534 by commission of the French king to find a western passage to the lucrative markets of Asia. A secondary goal of Cartier and subsequent French explorers was establishing land claims for France. Eventually, the land claims proved to be profitable, and the hope of finding a western passage was discarded. As more French explorers claimed North American land and established forts for France, French missionaries and adventurers migrated to the New World to convert Native Americans and capitalize on the emerging lucrative fur trade. But the question asked about the goal of the first French explorers. So even though the Northwest Passage doesn't exist, you still need to know what it is. Now, it's close to impossible to know every single detail about every historical event that may come up on your exam. And this is not the best use of your time. However, knowing key points on major events throughout history will help prepare you to use test-taking strategies to find the best answer for history questions. And we have the most important history lessons ready for you in our study guide. Now let's take a look at an economic question. Mr. Scott begins a project among his 4th grade class. He gives the class $20 to purchase pencils and has his students sell them to students who have forgotten their pencils at home. Which of the following economic principles can Mr. Scott's students learn from this project? Mr. Scott is introducing his students to the concept of supply and demand because his students would supply pencils to students that forgot them at home and needed them, or to those who had a demand for the pencils. Now let's take a look at a government question. Which amendment abolished slavery in America? The 1st, 13th, 16th, or the 17th? The correct answer is B. The 13th Amendment, passed in 1865, outlaws the institution of slavery in the United States. It states, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." Remember, 13, 14, 15 are all post-Civil War amendments to end slavery and increase voting rights. Now that's just a small sliver of practice questions to give you an idea about how these concepts are assessed on the test. There is still plenty more to learn.
This video is going to prepare you for the Core Subjects EC-6 Science Subtest. We've got a lot to do, so let's get moving. Now, the Core Subjects EC-6 Science Subtest consists of 18 areas called competencies. Yeah, 18. It's a lot. That's more than any other test in EC-6. Maybe we stop here and take a deep breath. Okay, now we're ready. And don't worry, I hope you make sense of all of them. Here's the list of competencies as they're given to you, but we can clean this up a bit. Competencies 1 through 6 relate to science instruction and general overarching science concepts. Let's group these and call them Domain A, Teaching Science. Competencies 7 through 10 include forces in motion, physical and chemical properties, and 2 on energy. Let's call this domain Physical Science. Competencies 11 through 14 cover information about living organisms. So let's call those Life Science. And finally, competencies 15 through 18 relate to Earth and space. So let's call them that. Whew, much better. Each of these domains contains an entire section of science education. But don't worry, we'll break it down piece by piece. And to test each of those pieces today, stay with me to the end and check out our test-aligned practice questions. First up, teaching science. Now, while TExES doesn't officially tell you how many questions are in each competency, it's about 2 questions each. And since this domain has the most competencies, 6 of them, it has the most questions on the exam. The first competency is pretty easy. Most safety questions are going to be common sense, like wearing goggles around chemicals and glass. You may also see a question on when to use specific equipment, like a graduated cylinder. Moving on. The history and nature of science is a bit of a potpourri, hodgepodge box of chocolates. For the history part, you might be asked what someone like Newton did. For the nature part, you can't forget the scientific method. And because this is a teaching test, you'll be asked a lot about teaching kids that scientific method. One of the most popular ways is using inquiry-based learning. There may also be questions about teaching critical thinking and other science skills. Oh, my favorite, the impact of science. So the next time a student asks, "Why are we learning this?" you have that answer locked and loaded. One key thing to know, the difference between renewable and non-renewable resources. Here's how the 240 guide breaks it down. Basically, renewable resources renew. Think green energy and crops. Now, non-renewable resources do not. Think fossil fuels and minerals. Next, concepts and processes. That's not descriptive at all, is it? So let's take a look at some ideas here. Think of this area as the unifying framework. Within science, some things are true if you're studying biology or chemistry or physics or whatever. For example, systems are units scientists study. That could be the human body or a test tube or an ecosystem. They all have inputs and outputs, boundaries, and feedback loops. There are a few others, like how form and function always go together. Things change and hit an equilibrium, and each branch of science uses various models. Okay, these next two things are about teaching, instruction, and assessment. First up, teaching. You'll need to know best practices using digital technology, diversity, and differentiation, increasing engagement, removing misconceptions, and fostering critical thinking comes up here again. And then after you teach it, of course, you have to assess it. Like all TExES exams, you need to know the difference between informal and formal, informative and summative. Before we leave domain A, here's one last tip. Since your science knowledge will help you answer these questions, we recommend studying for the other competencies first. For example, you may be asked what resource to use to teach a certain topic or which technology fits with a particular concept. The more you know about those, the easier it will be to pick out the best choice to teach it. Whew, we made it through the first domain. And for better or worse, that was the only one focused on teaching. The rest of the domains are all subject matter content. Let's start with physical science. This is basically simple physics and chemistry. Up first, forces in motion. There are some words with specific meanings here, and they're words you might use in everyday life, but now you need to know the official scientific definition. Make sure you know the difference between displacement and distance, and speed and velocity. Similarly, you'll want to know the difference between mass and weight, all three of Newton's laws, the 6 types of simple machines, and the mechanical advantage they each provide. Got all that? If you need to brush up on any of those, use the link below to get the 240 guide. Moving on to physical and chemical properties. Definitely make sure you know the difference between those terms, both for properties and also for changes. A physical change that comes up a lot is phase changes, like going from a liquid to a gas. Here's an image from our guide. Notice there are specific names for each change, and at each phase, the molecules behave differently. Now, there's a bunch of other stuff they could ask you for this competency, but that's the biggie to make sure you know. Now, did you notice that energy is in the title of the last two? Look how many times the word energy appears in the descriptive statements. 11. Makes sense, right? TExES is pretty into energy. You'll want to make sure you know the difference between kinetic and potential energy, heat and temperature, and the 3 movements of energy: conduction, convection, and radiation. Let's watch a clip from a 240 study guide video for this last one.
Remember, there are 3 main ways thermal energy is transferred: conduction, through a solid or between 2 materials that are touching; convection, by a moving fluid; and radiation, by an electromagnetic wave.
And that's the key stuff to know in physical science. Next up, life science. Most people like this one the best. Now again, these subjects are broad. In fact, you can major in just one of these competencies. So let's go through a few things you'll need to know for each. First up, structure and function. Many small children are shocked to learn that there are no baby butterflies. They hatch from eggs as caterpillars. That's called complete metamorphosis. And that, plus many other life cycles, can come up on this exam. You'll also want to know the requirements of life, why a rock isn't alive, the parts and types of cells, and human and plant body systems. If you need to brush up on all of that, it's all in the 240 study guide. Wait, go back to that. Here's that complete versus incomplete metamorphosis bit. See how the butterfly has a pupa stage? That's how it completely changes. Moving right along, let's go to reproduction and heredity. They should really call this genetics battle royale because it's all about knowing who wins the fights within pairs of terms. Like, seriously, look at all these pairs of terms to know. That's so many. Good thing the 240 guide has flashcards. Moving on. Contrary to popular rumors, TExES does teach evolution. You're going to need to know the basics. All living things have adaptations that help them thrive in their environment. How did they get them? Let's take a look. According to natural selection, reproductive success varies. This is survival of the fittest, you've probably heard of. Over time, you get more individuals with these favorable traits. And so eventually, the species gets adaptations. Also, make sure you know what artificial selection is. Last up in life science, organisms and the environment. Basically, ecology. Again, you can major in just ecology. So there are a lot of basics to know here. Let's take a look at one that comes up often, homeostasis. Homeo means same, and stasis means state. So homeostasis is the ability to remain in the same condition. Basically, how organisms balance out the condition they're in. If you get hot, your body sweats to cool off. So I'm doing homeostasis under these studio lights right now. Within your body, lots of organs work hard to maintain homeostasis, like your kidneys constantly filtering your blood. Reptiles, plants, and even fungi all do homeostasis. And that wraps up life science. We're almost done with the content, and then we'll move into practice questions. The last domain is Earth and space science. Up first, structure and function of the Earth. You need to know the names and properties of the layers of the Earth and the atmosphere. So from the inner core all the way out to space. One key layer of the Earth is the lithosphere, which forms tectonic plates. Movement within the lithosphere drives constructive and destructive processes. Here's an example from our guide. As two plates move apart, the mantle comes up and constructs new crust. Some change happens again and again, and we call those Earth cycles. There are 4 you need to know for this test: rock, water, carbon, and nitrogen. You can Google them and hope they cover what you need to know, or just watch ours. Next up, energy. Again? Yep. This time with a focus on weather and climate. Speaking of, make sure you know the difference between those two terms. Weather is short term, while climate is long term. Make sure you know what causes weather and climate. For example, the rain shadow effect makes areas behind mountains drier. Okay, last up, basic astronomy. Now, I know it says solar system and the universe over there, but the exam really likes to ask questions closer to Earth. I'm talking about the lunar cycle. Make sure you know why the moon appears differently across the 28-day cycle. Here's another image of the 240 guide. Notice that as the relative positions of the Earth, Sun, and Moon change, so does how the moon appears to people on Earth. And those are the big things you need to know here. Now that we've gone over some of the big concepts, let's look at some practice questions to show you how those concepts can appear on the test. Now for questions. Let's start all the way back at the beginning in the teaching science domain. First up, lab safety. Which of the following is a safe laboratory procedure? Many volatile compounds are quite toxic and can produce long-lasting health effects. Fume hoods are designed to increase airflow and remove fumes and protect any lab occupant from inhaling them. So this is the best answer. Let's check out that concepts and processes section. Which of the following accurately summarizes the difference between a hypothesis, a scientific theory, and a scientific law? The best choice here is D. A hypothesis is a predicted outcome. A theory is a proposed explanation based on evidence. And the law is a documented description of observations surrounding a phenomenon. Now let's do one more in Domain A. How about assessment and instruction? Which of the following statements best describes a formative assessment? Summative assessments are used to determine what students know at the end of the year or at the end of a unit. But formative assessments measure what students know along the way. They should be given on a regular basis. Domain A? Done. Now we're moving on to the actual science questions, starting with physical science, specifically simple machines. Jennifer moves her wheelchair up a ramp to enter a building. The ramp she is using is an example of which simple machine? While all the answers listed are simple machines, an inclined plane or ramp is the example of a simple machine which increases the distance of travel but decreases the force needed. Now let's look at another question on matter. A solid gold bar is melted in a smelter. Which of the following statements correctly compares the volume of the solid bar to the volume of the liquid gold? Volume is a measure of space occupied. Although both have the same number of molecules, the heat needed to melt the gold increases the spaces between molecules in the liquid. The liquid will have a greater volume. So this is the best answer. Had enough of physical science? Let's move on to life science. Specifically, let's talk about metamorphosis. The diagram shows the life cycle of which of the following organisms? The butterfly is the only organism listed that undergoes complete metamorphosis, which includes a pupa stage. And how about those natural selection questions? What do those look like? Pressures driving natural selection include all of the following except climate change, available resources, and predator-prey relationships all do drive natural selection. But equal populations of all organisms would not drive natural selection to occur. So this is the best choice. We're almost there, just one domain left. Let's peek into Earth and space science questions. How about a question on the rock cycle? Pieces of broken rock often become cemented together to form a new rock. This rock is referred to as, this is the best answer. Sedimentary rocks are formed when sediments or pieces of broken rock are cemented together to form a new rock. And last but not least, how about we check out a question on phases of the moon? Which of the following best describes the conditions of a full moon? A full moon occurs when the full face of the moon is illuminated by the sun and visible from the earth. So this is the correct choice. This only occurs when the earth is between the moon and the sun. And that's the last of the practice questions. There is still plenty to learn.
This video is going to prepare you for the core subjects EC through 6, Fine Arts, Health, and Physical Education subtest. There is a lot to cover, so let's get started. Now, the core subjects, EC through 6 Fine Arts, Health, and PE, consists of 5 areas called competencies. These are visual arts, music, health, physical education, and theater. Each competency has descriptive statements that will give more detail about what will be covered on your exam. However, as you can see, these might leave you feeling even more confused. Don't worry, that's where I come in. Let's take care of our fine arts competencies first, then we'll finish up with health and PE. Competency 1 covers visual arts, so art you look at. You'll need to know elements of art such as color, texture, shape, form, line, space, and value, and principles of art like emphasis, contrast, pattern, rhythm, balance, proportion, and unity. That sounds like a lot of terms, but guess what? We have them all covered in our study guide. But let's go ahead and take a look at some art now and talk through a couple of the elements. Maybe you'll feel like you're spending a peaceful afternoon at an art museum with me. I bet you didn't expect that benefit when you press play on this video. As an element of art, line refers to a moving point on the surface of a canvas or other media. It has width as well as length. The functions of line are to direct our eyes around and through a composition and to express our moods and feelings. What kind of mood or feelings do you have from the use of line in this piece of art? Drop in a comment below. Let's discuss one more element. As an element of art, a shape is a two-dimensional area defined by a boundary. Geometric shapes are mathematical in proportion, such as circle, square, rectangle, or triangle. Organic shapes are irregular and or curved, usually derived from nature. We see examples of both types of shape in this piece of art. If you want to see the rest of the elements, as well as everything else you need to know to pass this exam, check out the 240 study guide. But now, let's move on to the music competency. Here you'll answer questions about the concepts and skills related to the creation and appreciation of music. Let me be real with you. A lot of different concepts about music will come up here. I'm going to go over an amazing concrete concept you should know. But to really get the confidence you deserve to pass the test, you need to get the 240 study guide, link in the description. Now, how about that concrete concept you'll need to know for the music competency? Let's discuss a musical arrangement called a round. A round is a song in which two or more people sing exactly the same melody, but they begin at different times. Popular rounds include Row, Row, Row Your Boat and The Farmer in the Dell. When teaching students to sing rounds, begin by having the entire group sing in unison. Then, as students become more familiar with the words, rhythm, and melody, have students begin singing at different times. And here's a tip. Creating choreography for different parts of the song will add interest and excitement. I know you can't wait to show off your best dance moves. We're going to skip health and PE for now, but don't worry, we'll cover them in just a bit. Let's boogie on into our final fine arts competency. Here you'll need to know all about engaging theater instruction. Let me show you a descriptive statement that I think is extra important for this competency. Integrates instruction in theater with instruction in other subjects areas. Aha! Integrating with other subjects. There's a lot of potential there. There are characters in plays just like there are characters in stories. Studying both theater and fiction can help students understand characterization. Also, reader's theater is a popular tool for teachers to use to help students develop reading fluency. While they're practicing reading with expression, they are also learning about following directions on scripts. Oh, and let's not forget about social studies. There are many theatrical productions that align with historical events covered in TExES. Look for ways that elements of theater can support classroom instruction. Tired yet? Good, me either. Let's keep the study session going. The health competency covers a wide array of topics, ranging from human body systems to growth and development to family behaviors and lots in between. Let's spend our time together talking about ways to maintain a healthy lifestyle. These are important to know for your exam. And maybe you'll get a little inspiration. Teaching is a big job, but don't forget to make time for your health. A healthy lifestyle consists of many factors, such as nutrition, fitness, exercise, relaxation, stress management, and disease prevention. There are several effective ways to take a proactive approach to disease prevention, including practicing moderation for consuming foods and beverages high in sugar, which can elevate blood sugar and increase the risk of diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. Getting enough sleep is also important for disease prevention and overall health. Lack of sleep is associated with reduced cognitive function and a higher risk of developing cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, stroke, and diabetes. And both of these practices are beneficial and appropriate to introduce to elementary students as part of their health instruction. All right, ready to get fit? Let's sprint into our physical education competency. This competency is all about physical activity, including strategies for promoting a positive environment for all students to learn about and work on their fitness. Here's a tip. If you see a question about students struggling with an activity, look for the answer that removes the obstacle and allows students to have success. For example, young students struggling to hit a ball off a tee use a bigger ball. This would provide a bigger target for students, but they would still be completing the original activity. You'll also need to be familiar with physical education terminology. Let's go over a couple of words that are highly likely to come up on your exam. Locomotor skills involve moving the body from one location to another. Most locomotor movements involve the feet, but they may also include the hands. Some examples are walking, running, jumping, hopping, galloping, and skipping. Non-locomotor skills involve moving the body while remaining stationary. Examples include bending, stretching, twisting, swaying, wiggling, shaking, and balancing. So basically, with locomotor activity, you go somewhere, and with non-locomotor, you don't. Now that we've gone over some of the big concepts, let's look at some practice questions to show you how those concepts can appear on the test. If you want a lot of practice questions, you can click the free practice test below. At the end, you get a score report on how well you did on the test. Now for questions. Remember when we talked about elements of art? Let's look at how those are reflected in a question. Prior to asking a class of fourth graders to paint a picture of the sky, the teacher shows them a model and discusses how the intensity of color changes within the painting, with colors near the sun being brighter than colors further away. The teacher is using this activity to introduce which of the following elements of art: value, form, texture, or space. Now I have to admit, my first thought was choice D, space. But when I click on that as I'm working through my study guide, I see that it's not the best choice. The best part is the answer feedback also helps me see why space is not correct. The answer is actually value, which is the amount of lightness or darkness a color has. Let's look at one from the music competency. Remember, a lot of different concepts will be covered here. What is the importance of learning solfege according to the Kodaly concept? The correct answer is that it helps students understand how notes relate to one another. Feel like you need to know more about that? It's covered in the study guide. All right, let's move on to a question from the theater competency. Miss McKenzie wants her students to understand that theater has an impact throughout history and on many different cultures through the telling of stories. Which of the following activities would best promote this concept among students? Having each student research a notable story to find the culture and significance of the story. Then have the student read aloud the story and their research findings is the best choice. The students would better understand how various stories originate in different cultures and how the culture is reflected within the story. Now let's answer a question about health. Children are more susceptible to asthma than adults because, well, although physical activity might bring on an asthma attack, increased physical activity does not result in development of asthma. So this is not our answer. Increased time outside also does not result in development of asthma, so we can eliminate this one. People do not develop immunity to asthma, so this is not the one we want either. The bronchial tubes or passageways that allow air to enter and leave the lungs in infants and toddlers are small and narrow, making this our correct answer. Let's finish up with a PE question. Which of the following activities would best help develop the movement concept of spatial awareness? Spatial awareness is an awareness of oneself and other objects in space. Spatial awareness also includes understanding the relationships of objects when there is a change in position. Children would use these skills to accurately throw balls into buckets at varying distances. Now that's just a small sampling of practice questions to give you an idea about how these concepts are assessed on the test. There's still plenty more to learn. Did you know that our study guide has 78 pages of study material? If you really want to make sure you're prepared for the core subjects EC-6, Fine Arts, Health, and PE exam, take the next step and subscribe to the 240 study guide. It is test aligned with hundreds of practice questions, so you know precisely what you need to to study, and it has the money back guarantee. So click the link below right now to get started.